Hi folks, Paul here with a follow-up to my previous Powerwall video, which was my 5-year review. And at the end of that video I disassembled my original Powerwall, the one that featured in all my early Powerwall videos, which was a bit sad pulling it apart. But I knew I had to because one of the groups in that Powerwall was measuring 1.6 volts, I think. So these are the pairs of cells out of that bad group, and then I've got a few randomly selected pairs out of the rest of the Powerwall just to compare. So I've collected some data on what condition these are in order to try and find the presumably bad 1 or 2 cells and see what they all look like. Alright, so the first column here shows the capacity as I measured it way back in 2016, and at that time I was using a IMAX V6 charger, which was the cheapest way of measuring capacity back then, and then I also measured the internal resistance with the iCharger, and these are all the numbers I got. So the interesting thing is, one is I had quite a wide spread of capacities within one particular group, so that's not ideal. There's a spread there of 1,600 milliamp hours, which is quite a lot. And then in terms of the internal resistance, for some reason I had this cell, pair of cells actually, that was 149 milliohms, and I seem to remember I had a threshold of 120 as my maximum internal resistance number. So I don't know how I managed to slip that in. I may have been desperate right when I was wanting to make the pack and needing to put in some outlier cells. That was not a very smart thing to do. So once I separated them, I measured the voltage, and they're all about 1.7 something, 1.8 sometimes. The ones in purple, those are the 4 test cells that come from the other groups, so they're just in there as a control to compare what a pair of cells from the non-bad group look like. They're all 3.9, 3.7, that's all fine. So the interesting thing is the pair that had the highest internal resistance also had a voltage that was higher than the rest of the group. So that's interesting. And then we had this one here, which was way below the rest of the cells. So clearly this is the one that was dragging the whole group down. And there's a few other data points later on that confirm that. What is slightly disconcerting is there was nothing overly obvious about the pair of cells before I put them in the pack to indicate any kind of issue with this pair of cells. If I was doing this over again, that's still the kind of pair of cells that it was below my internal resistance threshold, and the capacity was kind of okay, so I would have put that in again. It's not obviously a bad pair going in. So what that suggests is that at some point in the last 5 years, that pair of cells tipped over the edge and started to go bad. So I measured the voltage, and then I threw them all into my TP4056 chargers, and they all charged up happily except this pair with the high internal resistance, and it took more than 24 hours to charge, so I actually pulled it out because it was like twice as long as all the other cells took to charge up. So that is quite disconcerting. Then 3 days later I measured the voltage again. So these charged the cells up to, is it 4.15 or 4.2? Probably 4.2 roughly. And so measured the voltage again 3 days later, and a pair of cells or a single cell has to be pretty bad to lose much voltage in only 3 days. But we had this cell here, that was the high internal resistance cell, that dropped below 4.1, so that's a bad sign. And this cell here dropped way down to 3.8, so that one is a real disaster, that pair of cells. That's clearly the bad apple. Then I put them in my Opus BTC 3100 charger and discharged them to measure the capacity, and got all these numbers here. And the interesting thing is that most of them are quite a bit higher than my original numbers after 5 years. So that raises some interesting questions. Did the cells get better in the 5 years, except for this one? Probably not. They might have got slightly better. The other difference is this is the IMAX results, and this is the Opus charger results. So maybe the charger itself is discharging down to a lower level and getting a little bit more capacity that way. It is possible that when I charged and discharged these, I would have taken them straight out of the laptop battery, separated them into the pairs, charged them up and discharged them, and that's what this number is. And so that's basically a single cycle after having been probably dormant for months or even years at the recycler. And so if I had cycled these cells for 3 times, perhaps I would get a better number early on. But certainly that's quite an interesting difference, these two capacity numbers. And I think they're all pretty much all higher. Where's one that isn't higher? This one is still about the same. This one's higher. So this is the only one that's a lot lower. And so clearly this one was well on the way out at this stage. That's higher. Yeah, so those are interesting results, and I don't have a really good, solid explanation for that. Perhaps these lithium cells, once they live in a Powerwall and the gentle cycling that they get in a Powerwall, does have the effect of reconditioning them somewhat, perhaps. So then the next day I charged them up again, and interestingly this cell here, which is pretty nondescript, generic pair, it charged up to 4.21 volts. 4.21 volts. It's slightly overcharged, ever so slightly. Everything else charged up fine, including this one here. So that is also interesting. And then I measured the internal resistance again, and this is also interesting. So this is measured by the Opus versus the iCharger 5 years ago, and the numbers here are pretty close. I always assumed that the IMAX would have really wild internal resistance measurements because it was such a cheap charger. But these don't look far off. 10%, they're within 10% mostly, and even this bad pair here, 149 versus 147. That's pretty accurate. And then the only one that has a really high discrepancy is, again, this really low cell that was on the way out. It was 104 5 years ago, and now it's 163. So clearly that one is a disaster. Not so much of a disaster that it caused any harm or damage yet, and I'm really glad that this whole pack was running on with a BMS, so it kept this relatively in line, and it stopped any kind of really bad stuff happening. The takeaways are the Opus capacity results are very interesting 5 years later. It's interesting that the internal resistance numbers are so similar 5 years later, mostly, except for this one. And it's disappointing that there was no obvious clues from the measurements going in to identify this as a bad cell. So that is the real killer. It suggests that prior to making a pack, if you're using recycled laptop cells that have had their own life, that you don't know what the hell is going on, you need to be more vigilant than maybe you were expecting. Really got to keep an eye on the group voltage levels, and if you see one group trending below everything else, then you really do need to rip it out and pull it apart, because something in there is likely to be pulling it down. And I wish I had never put that pair of cells in there in the first place. That was a mistake, and this was not a mistake, but it went bad over the 5 years. Having said that, 5 years is a long time for these old cells to be, all these other cells are chugging along quite happily. I would want to take that out and that out. The rest of the cells I could imagine putting back in a pack of some sort, and who knows how long they'll last. 5 years is pretty good for second-hand cells. Alright, well, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers!